We could give us a couple seconds here, people to settle in here and get situated for our next session. Day 5 here of the Scores Poetry Summit, Words in Action. Really looking forward to this next session. And we will go ahead and do the formal kickoff. So welcome to everybody, to our panelists. Thank you to folks working behind the scene here. Alicia, this has been a fantastic series of sharing and connecting through poetry, learning, listening. And we're really excited again about today's session. Much of what we've been talking about is intercultural and bridging and connecting with people. And how do we do that with poetry across languages? How do we do that across time? And how do we do that across, languages and regions? And we're going to get into that soon. So my name is Colin Schmidt. I'm the Executive Director of America Scores Bay Area. We run soccer and poetry and service learning programs for thousands of youth. We're here in the Bay Area working with public schools, and we're a part of an affiliated network in 11 cities with over 1,000 writing coaches, poetry coaches, and over 12,000 poet athletes. So the summit is in support of them, raising awareness about our programs, and really just sharing the beauty and the playfulness and the transformative power of poetry. Need to thank our sponsors for this, Soma Equity Partners and the SAC Brand Group. Thank you all for making this happen. And also want to announce that we'll be giving away some tickets in every live session. We're giving away tickets to our special Rising Voices event coming up later in April 21st, where we showcase not the right word, where we share the voices of our poet athletes, along with a professional spoken word artist, Brandon Leak, who won America's Got Talent, first ever spoken word artist to win that national competition. So we're excited about that event, excited to share some swag with somebody out there today, and super excited about this session. Stephen Gomez is here with us. Stephen is a poet, an author, a deep thinker. He is a friend of Scores, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. He's been to our poetry events. He's worked in collaboration with us. He's connected us with philanthropic partners. So he's a real friend of the organizations. And we're going to talk about the art of translation, and a lot of what we'll be talking about using Stephen will share examples of literature, but of his own literature, his own book, A Woman Growing Younger, which is beautiful work of poetry written in English and in Spanish, and with art also. It's a three-way relationship, really, with language and art. And Stephen, I want to start with this quote that we found from Cervantes, because I think it's so good, and I think it'll tee up the discussion here. Translating from one language to another, unless it is from Greek and Latin, the queens of all languages, is like looking at a Flemish tapestry from the wrong side. For although the figures are visible, they are covered by threads that obscure them and cannot be seen with the smoothness and color of the right side. So, Stephen, let me turn it over to you to welcome you, to introduce you, to thank you again for being here and for sharing your knowledge on this important and interesting subject.
Hello all, and thanks for attending. That was old Cervantes had a really interesting career as a soldier and quite a character in general. But I think when I read that quote, I said the only thing I would have interjected, instead of saying the queen of all languages, I would have said the queen of romance languages. Okay, and I think it's an important distinction when we talk about translations, because even English, which we know is partially a Romance language, there arises all these difficulties because a lot of English also is Germanic. I mean, you get your common everyday words like good. Where does that come from? Gut in German, but where does a word like aspiration come from? Well, obviously that's Latin. So we have this mismatch of language in English, and it's a relatively new language compared to Spanish. And so when Spaniards get a hold, or a literate, intelligent person gets a hold of English and starts to translate it into Spanish, English can almost appear to be simplistic in a lot of ways. So as I know, when my work was being translated, my translator, who was also a Greek and Latin scholar, would say, well, this adjective you used here, in Spanish, you have these choices, and there'd be like four adjectives. And I go, well, I only know one of them. So which one do you think is the most appropriate? I mean, the language is so rich and so layered. And that's the beauty of Spanish, from a literary perspective, as Arabic, which has a huge tradition of poetry, reaching back, again, as old as Spanish. And so it's really interesting to when you compare the two. So when you get into translation, that's part of the difficulty is bridging that chasm linguistically. And then it's also the complexities of, as we talked about before, the translation, which incorporates culture and historic content, in addition to linguistic, rhythmic, and pacing. So all these factors come into play. And so that's why when most modern writers find a good translator, they're wedded to them because they feel that they can interpret their voice and to the degree they want it interpreted. I mean, I'm going to give you an example of a modern Spanish poet who's very well known in Spain, one of the best of the new poets, Alvaro Garcia, but he likes his poetry, his translations, to be like subtitles to a foreign movie. Otherwise, he wants to kind of reel you in to want to read it in Spanish, because the English translation is pretty bland, and I find it not very. It doesn't give me. There's no window into his culture or the context of what he's saying, as far as I'm concerned. But I have another example of a translation of Neruda, which I find he's inside of Neruda's mind and his feeling about the work. And I think that, to me, it's far more interesting, that type of translation, if you want to read the translation. So that's, and I'm going to cheat a little bit on this, because in my book, recently published, again in concert with Scores, Herbert Lindenberger, who's a fellow in the humanities at Stanford for over 50 years and a lecturer, was gracious enough to write the introduction in this book, in this collection, which is really worth reading, because he talks about not only how to read poetry, but he talks about poetry in translation, and the other, what he calls a triptych, is poetry translated and then with art. So you have this luxury of these three different sort of layers of interest, so to speak, and the creative process. So I'm going to just jump into what he has to say about Yolanda Luna and her translations, because I think it kind of nails it. So it says, he goes on, he says, Yolanda Luna's sensitive Spanish translation, as we compare these translations to their English counterpart, we recognize that they embody an entirely different linguistic cadence. Every language allows its poets specific choices, and these are dependent both on the nature of the language and on the poetic practices and conventions developed over centuries. If English poetry can rely heavily upon consonants, monosymblistic words, and nouns that can be easily converted to adjectives, then Spanish poetry often features resonant vowels, inflected multi-syllable words, and nouns carefully separated from their modifiers. Consider the following lines from Fish Armies. Back, back, then forward to the dawn of passion, where the screeching of seagulls scorches the ear as they huddle atop trash heaps left by spawning humans on the ashen beaches. Note the cacophony achieved with the S and H sound in the first four lines, and note as well the abrupt and crackling effect of the words seagulls, in which two stressed monosymbol symbols collide, or perhaps even more conspicuous, the three sequential stresses in atop trash heaps. By contrast, the Spanish renders these lines exhibits a quite different set of characteristics. Atrás, atrás, ahora adelante, hacia el alba de pasión, donde el chillado de los gaviotas queman el oído, mientras se apiñan sobre pilas de basura que dejan el sobe humano en las playas de ceniza. With its multi-syllable words, the Spanish version tends to move more slowly than its English equivalent. Ashen beaches, which allows ash to turn into an adjective, is forced in the Romance language to become two nouns separated by a preposition. And the curt atop trash heaps gives way to the more lyrical iambics of sobre pilas de basura, in which the trash gains a degree of dignity it never attains in English. Yet, despite the differences in what each language and poetic tradition will allow, Luna gives the screeching of seagulls its own high-volume music with El chillado de las gaviotas. So this is just an example of, briefly, that Herbert Lindenberger picks up on, and he spoke German and read in French and Italian, and he was just an incredible Renaissance person, and so I think this is just a window into how that world works, and how those differences in linguistic traditions can change. So with someone like Yolanda Luna, it's like giving her the clay and then letting her create her own statue, so to speak. And again, some poets don't like a translator to have that much latitude. But you know, Yolanda Luna is someone I've known my whole life, and is an artistic and creative person, and I mean a phenomenon, and just she became a poet, and just really enjoyed the process, and has basically translated all of my work, and still does today. So that's very interesting. So then I would say, then I'll give you an example of what I consider subtitles. So there's a short poem by, this is Alvaro Garcia, who's one of the leading young poets in Spain today. And his poetry is not as laden with historic context and archetypes and all this stuff, certainly as some of the stream of consciousness things I do, or certainly not someone like Bob Dylan, but there's still that subtle context to his work that I think his translator misses, that either purposely or maybe that's what Alvaro wanted him to do, misses that altogether. For example, this is called mercancía, is the word in Spanish. He calls it in English fancy goods, which is an interesting translation that I don't think is quite the same. But if you hear it, it says, in the midst of a slow, almost motionless life, there remains for us the embers of a dream, the sweet echo of having seen the sunrise over solitary streets. A refined surprise, a light green chaos, the burning chill a saint might feel in the snow, or blood on broken glass. At all this solitude, I used to smile. To me, then you read it in Spanish and says, de una vida uniforme y lenta. You can just hear the difference in the tone. Nos quedan un rescolón de sueño, en hecho dulce de hacer visto, el alba de las avenidas solas. To me, it's just, I get nothing from the translation. I mean, it's translated, and if I don't understand a word, I can look over to the page and see that word in English, but it's just not particularly artful, and I don't know why. And that's, as I say, if that's what Alvaro was looking for in a translator, or if that's just the limited skill of this translator. La Tormenta is another example, the storm. Like that man looking for a word to save him from himself, not finding it until it's too late and the building's closed and no more visitors will be let in, and there's no salvation inside anyway. It's kind of like, geez, that's strange. It doesn't even sound poetic to me. Como el que busca una palabra para salvar de sí mismo y no le encuentran hasta que estás tarde y el edificio está cerrado. It just, I mean, the poetry in Spanish is, to me, very pretty. It's beautiful. He doesn't use a lot of, heavy archetypes, or it's not stream of consciousness to me to any particular degree. But I think the translation could be a lot different. And an example of what I think is more, maybe it's just my own taste, but here's Pablo Neruda, and this is his poetry about the sea, and it's called Nace, or It Is Born in English. So so this is the translation. See if you can kind of feel a difference between that and the translator of Alvaro's book. Here I came to the very edge where nothing at all needs saying. Everything is absorbed through weather and the sea, and the moon sways back, its rays all silvered. Y aquí vino a los límites y donde no hay que decir nada. Todo es aprende con tiempo y océano, y volvía la luna sus líneas plateadas. I mean, I find poetry in the translation. And here I came to the very edge where nothing at all needs saying. Everything absorbs through the weather and sea, and the moon swam back, its rays all silvered. So to me, those are some of the examples of translation. So it almost seems arbitrary, but I have a collection, and this is why when people ask me about collections of poetry like Garcia Lorca, who was pretty prolific, his collections will have 7 different translators, and it's almost jarring from one translator to the next what you get. Where some are, again, because they're not asking Garcia Lorca, because he's obviously not with us, so they translate some very liberally, and some create their own poetry with the translation, and some are just, their subtitles are just translating, and some are really translating it so badly that because they think they're creating something poetic, and they're really just kind of destroying the whole feeling of the poem, in my opinion. But that's why it's better, in my opinion, to look to specific translators, and I would say one of the best for Garcia Lorca would be Sarah Arvillo, who's a translator, and it's called Poet in Spanish, Garcia Lorca. And I would recommend that type of a translator, and look for that kind of person when you're looking at these major poets, rather than these just big collections that are translated by a whole number of people, because I just find them, it's just the inconsistency gets you nuts, because you're trying to get into the rhythm of what they're saying, and then in the context that translator is bringing to the table for you, and it's not. And and unless some people are reading it in Spanish and only want a brief, again, as I say, brief subtitles. It's like sometimes I watch a complicated film in Spanish and it has English subtitles, and my eyes drop down just to kind of clarify what's going on in the action. And if that's what you're looking for, then that's fine. But I think you miss a big chunk of what could be there if these things are properly translated, and the person doing the translation is a quality translator and maybe a poet in their own right. So I'm going to jump to another part of Mr. Lowenberg's preface, and when he discusses poetry in general. So he says, as in all good poetry, the formal construction and objects on which the concentration serves essentially as an anchor for the exploration of what language can do. We do not read On the Night Train from Chamartin, one of my poems, to explore the geography of Spain, though of course we get glimpses of that country. The first light shadows of dawn chase across the olive groves of Garcia Lorca, nor do we read My Room to learn about the poet's living quarters, though doubtless, if pressed, he might indicate a spot or two that reveals something about his domicile. So what he's saying is that you really want to, find your own voice, so to speak, within the context of what you're reading, rather than try to look for an interpretation. he goes on to talk about the longest and perhaps most ambitious poem in this volume, The Brief Life of Brother Lizard, is a textbook example of the unexpected at work in furtherance of Gomez's vision. The poet's fusion of two seemingly incongruous images, the lowly animal in the title and the grisly, reclusive Christian monks, leaves the reader appropriately unsure of any particular point as to which and how of these striking images will step into the foreground or temporary recede into the background. The world of this poem is one of age and decay, old ruined missions, decrepit monks, disturbing scenes. In the lines such as these, the poet tests the reader with each new word. At dusk, the sun bending for its bed, the three-legged coyote, skeletal, crazed, gnaws at a rancid morsel of fur and sinew, remnants of a creature long ago gutted. Just a little, that's kind of but in Spanish, it's interesting. Again, almost like the poem about the seagulls in a way, the Spanish kind of absorbs that harshness and elongates the sound and the feel and kind of the soul of the whole thing. Al anochecer, al bajarse el sol en su hecho, un coyote cojo, el esqueleto, rábanos, devora un bocado rancio, el pelo y tendón, restos de una criatura tiempo atrás habitada. Very different feeling, so remnants of a creature long ago gutted are restos de una criatura tiempo atrás habitada. Very different lyrically how it sounds. And I think that and that's to me the treat of having the two good translation next to the original poem. And so then I want to talk a little bit about, in that same context, where are we here with, so in the preface, that's the preface, in the introduction, which I wrote, talk about, we get to our friend, Mr. Bob Dylan. And it says, there's also a musical, in the early tone poems of Bob Dylan, a disciple of the Beat generation, a mentor to the counterculture movement, and a prodigy of those times. Songs such as Desolation Row, arguably Dylan's greatest achievement in this genre, were created from a deconstructed series of colorful words reassembled in what sounds like random sequence. In Desolation Row, the stratas are loosely threaded together in a vaguely apocalyptic storyline, laden with ancient and contemporary archetypes and playful ironic allusions. Dylan's monotone voice becomes almost hypnotic when accompanied by a simple progression of guitar chords and notes. Nearly 12 minutes in length, this song attains a chant-like quality as listeners are lured into the artist's free-flowing narrative, best understood and appreciated in the reflection of their own mind. So this is what Dylan was trying to do with these early tone poems. And that's as they're referred to. And so then you go back to, you say to yourself, well, gee, Bob Dylan wrote this stuff. Well, and they gave him the Nobel Prize. Why didn't they give the Nobel Prize to the Beatles? They wrote some great stuff. But I think the difference is that, when you look at their songs in translation, like I was listening to Desolation Row in Italian, what they did is they beefed up the musical aspect of it to support the lyrics in a way, which Dylan was doing just the opposite. So you take like the Beatles, and if you've ever heard them sing "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in German, it's very interesting because they do a superb job. But you immediately remember, all you remember is hearing it in English, and the German just seems, because they hit the same notes, they play the same chord. I mean, it's exactly the same except it's in German. And then I think it was only Paul McCartney who liked to experiment in bringing in foreign languages, like when he wrote Michel, and he wanted to have that song, he wanted it in French. So he asked a friend's wife who was a French teacher, what are these words? What's pretty and what's rhymes with these words? Because he wanted to, kind of a deeply romantic character, wanted to, fall back on one of the most romantic of the Romance languages, which is French. And so, very, very interesting in those kind of experimental situations. But when you tear away the music and and just get right down to the lyrics of the songs, they're just that, they're lyrics. And that's why Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize, and that's why the Beatles not won the Nobel Prize. I mean, wildly popular, and I think, and I don't think Dylan has ever been praised overly much so for his great singing voice or his musical collaborations or anything else. It's a pretty secondary function of what he's doing. At least up until Blood on the Tracks, which was his last poetic album, and then after that he was just basically repeating himself and falling back on his old archetypes and basically perpetuating his self-created myth. And that's why I think Dylan is not, people go to see him today like they're going to see a relic that's still alive. But if you go back to those early days and listen to things like Desolation Row and Mr. Tambourine Man and some of those early just masterworks of poem, their stream of consciousness tone poems, you realize you'll say, okay, well, I know why they gave this guy the Nobel Prize. So at least the people that dove into his work in that respect automatically came out saying, wow, yeah, that he deserved it. So that's kind of important. So that's kind of the wrap on translations as far as I'm concerned. And I plug my own book because it helps scores, and I plug it also because it does have some good things written in there by other people besides myself that I think are a guide to reading poetry in translation, reading poetry or seeing poetry juxtaposed to art, and gives you a sense of just a better sense of how to just dive in and read poetry without worrying about, was that really the guy? Did the guy's room really, was it all messed up like that? I mean, or trying to look for hints or clues about the poet himself, because that's really not what the poetry's about. So there you have it. So if anybody, any questions or comments, I'm happy to chat.
No, fantastic, Stephen. You really gave us you really served up a buffet of ideas and thoughts and things to talk about, great examples as well. And I definitely want to invite Bo into the conversation, and David too. I'm hoping and guessing this is David Sullivan, who's done some work with translations. So we should get him in here. Again, this session will be archived, so it'll be referenced, and I couldn't imagine sort of a better small group here to elaborate a little bit on this subject, the art of translation. So anyways, so Bo, I see has a question. I want to invite him in. David, want to invite you in if that's possible. Stephen, and I'll just start with a question too while these guys put on their Zoom makeup here, whatever needs to happen. The image of you in North Beach listening to Desolation Row in Italian is beautiful. There's Bo. Welcome back, Bo. And we'll let you ask your question in just a minute. And suggest to the viewer here watching this session to also visit the other great sessions we've had this week, and particularly the one on the Al-Mutanabi Street Project, which touches on translation and remembrance. And Bo, you can mention that more if you like. And also David Sullivan's talk on his work, specifically with Arabic poetry and translation. And maybe David will comment and tease out some of those ideas as well. Stephen, and before we again go deeper into that discussion, the book, could you hold up the book, your book, and just show a little bit too of the.
Well, this is the paperback version, okay, mm-hmm. which you can buy on Amazon, or which is, if you really want to tear it apart and read it and make notes and stuff, it's better, I think, to get this version. We have the hand printed, beautiful, scores version that you can buy from Scores. I don't know what the going price is these days. It depends on the circumstances, but it's a beautiful book, and I would say minimum $50. But you give it away at poetry contests and things like that. It's kind of I call it an expensive calling card for Scores that I think it shows their seriousness about poetry, which is great.
And can you just show a little bit of the art too? I just wanted to, and here's my question too, just again, to open this up to discussion, just why did you choose to do it in this way, to not only do the English and the Spanish, but to also.
Well, this is also because Seti was this forgotten counterculture artist from San Francisco. And I thought, and he was friends with my younger brother, and I had 4 or 5 of his works on my wall, and I was thinking of this next collection of poetry because I used Gabriel Bacher's sketches in my first book. And I got up one morning and I sat there looking at these, they're like collages and they're incredible. And I was looking at him and I thought, my God, that's the guy that we have to get him involved in this, although he's long gone. But his work is so interesting. It's so layered and complex. It's a lot like, and I compare it to, the Dylan songs. I mean, they're like stream of consciousness poems in their own. When you look at these, they're very layered. I'm just trying to look what he had to say. Yeah, the variety of formal patterns and subjects shaping these poems is matched by the sometimes dizzying variety and shapes within Sati's collages. These complex illustrations add a striking visual dimension to this volume. As Gomez mentions in the introduction, Sati's richly layered, fantastic masterworks were meticulously cut out and pieced together from a wide range of source materials, presenting different times and different cultures. Gomez describes Seti's finest efforts as products of a creative process, very much like my own. So they're very stream of consciousness, and they just add a dimension to the book where you can look at these different works, and they're just fantastic on their own. And they are in most of the museums in San Francisco have archived some of his work from that period, and they're well reproduced in this paperback version, but in the really lovely version of the book, which has got its dust cover, you can just see the images are what they call, it's a process, it's a 19th century process they call tipping in, where they actually, because they did not have they couldn't reproduce things as well, but you can see, so this is tipped in, this is free floating on the page. And they're reproduced. Now we can reproduce them almost identically. Then they're cut out, lifted, and then set on the page. So in this kind of collector's version that Scores has control of, these are really, there are about 18 of these works of art in the book. So it's really an added dimension, which is really lovely.
Yeah, fantastic. Bo, did you want to jump in and make your question / comment?
Sure. Maybe I can just read it here. Let's see. Some translators can't resist trying to make the translation, quote, better, unquote, than the original poem. And those translators always have frightened me. There are also some poems that are simply not translatable, in quotes, in a cultural or historical sense, as in the carnage aftermath of war. How should those poems be brought into another culture? Can they only be done, in other words, by someone who has gone through a similar experience? Or if someone has gone through a similar experience, does that enrich the translation in terms of the choice of language?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think so. I mean, Seti per se was lived in the aftermath of the Second World War and bombed out city in Dresden. And I think his that impression as a young man made a huge difference in his collages. I mean, you can see the violence and you can see the complete chaos that's created in some of them. But I think that in the context of the Vietnam War at the time, I think that I think that experience and the sort of the graphic horror of it that people were watching on the television sets every day, I think that those people understood Seti's work, and I think the people that were interpreting his work like a poet of that time, and I think you definitely have to have had that experience, or at least absorbed it in some way, in the way of watching it and being sort of intensely moved by it. And but I think you also, it's like Conrad, Joseph Conrad. I mean, it's the art of recollection. It's the using your past experiences as a creative tool. And I think if you don't have the raw material, I think it makes it difficult.
David Sullivan, I'd love to invite you to the conversation if you're willing. Again, I know this is a subject you live a lot with. Yeah.
Great talk. Really wonderful to hear you and your perception. And I love that comment about collections by multiple translators, that it does feel like you are reading through the lens of different people's take and not reading the poet anymore. It's a strange mosaic effect. Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm working with Arabic speakers, mostly Iraqi poets, and I'm working with Iraqis whose English is fairly good, but a lot of my work, I'm not only going back and having them kind of correct my versions of them. It's hard to call them co-translations, but then having other Arabic speakers who are Iraqi read my work as well. So what do you think of the collaborative possibility? And it's obviously, the poet who actually wrote the poems and myself who kind of have final say, but a lot of it is then a collaboration with multiple viewpoints of the poem as it existed in Arabic and the version as existed as English, as a method to try and take some of the blood of the poem into the new language.
Yeah, I think, a lot of it, I think depends on the depth and breadth of the understanding of the other language. So if the poet understands enough, let's say I understand enough Spanish. I mean, I'm fluent, I'm not bilingual, but I understand enough to kind of get the drift of what's going on. And I think that, unlike my friend Alvaro, I like Yolanda Luna to have that license and feel she has the license to create the poetry within the context of what I'm saying. So, I think it's a very different journey. And I think if that's why when we do poetry readings, what I like to do is have, and I try to get actors and people that are really good at speaking and get one person in Spanish. I've got a friend of mine who's a great actor and he has this beautiful baritone voice in Spanish, and then get another good actor in English, and they go back and forth with the two languages, and you really get a sense of the rhythm and the different cadence and it's really a great experience. And I think that I think it's sort of is what the poet wants to achieve and who you want to reach in your when you're writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's been really nice when we've been able to do readings together and we get to hear the air, the musicality of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask on that subject? So again, in the book, your book, Stephen, and other books, you get both of them. You get the English and the Spanish. And you present them. You just, as you said, right, there's a performance where you hear both. Is that happening more? I mean, it seems to make sense, like if you're going to do a translation, that you would also have the source material so that the reader themselves can be, part of that interpretive process to see how things, were translated into past, not to pass judgment, but just to be part of that, experience. Is that So it was a deliberate choice for you, Stephen, but is it something that's happening a lot more with these
Well, I think,
times?
well, I think what David said is correct. So you're trying to present, these poems in Arabic. I think that sometimes there on my book, for example, there were 5 or 6 editors, both in English and in Spanish. So it wasn't just one person's voice doing this and correcting it. But I mean that Yolanda Luna certainly was the premier translator, and her interpretation or her version, let's say, so to speak, was the critical one, and that's the one we stood up to. But when you're, especially like it's performance poetry, it has to be a collaboration, because even the reader is going to have a fun time hitting certain words with a certain force and changing. It's almost an interpretation in itself, which I really like. I really enjoy. It's like our young poet laureate. When you hear people like that do actually perform poetry, it takes on a whole nother meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I've done with my students is I'll have them, read a poem, and multiple people will read it. And sometimes I'll hand them a card beforehand and give them a character to assume when they read the poem. Just feeling for how differently you can take words, parse words, enunciate words to change meaning and enhance interpretations.
Oh yeah, if you listen to the Italian version of Desolation Row, I mean that he's hitting all kinds of different, as he forces rhymes like Dylan does with certain words that don't rhyme, but they just make it happen with his voice. It starts to take on a whole nother, spirit onto itself. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's very, actually, I find it almost more enjoyable musically, certainly in the music and in the way he uses his voice and the music that's playing along with him. It's a whole different experience.
Bo, let me ask you that question from a publisher's standpoint. In a literary enthusiast, do you like to see things in multiple languages in print together, or do you feel like the translations really should stand alone?
Yeah, I'm not really a publisher, although we have an anthology from the project. But I love things in both languages, but the cost of doing a book in 2 languages is, it's really prohibitive, especially for a small press, to try and do a real body of work. But I know, one of the things that I was thinking about just now was that for poets that I've read in translation, if I really begin to admire what the translation is, I really develop a palpable thirst to hear them read it in their own language. For exactly what David was talking about and what Stephen was talking about, there's that kind of rhythm that sometimes the poet themselves isn't even aware of. But as a reader, when you really immerse yourself in someone else's work, it can be so enriching to hear that, even if you don't understand the language, but hearing the rhythm and the pauses in the poem, I think are wonderful. So it would be great to have a book where you not only, or maybe that's an alternative, you had the translation on one side in English, but included with the book was an audio recording of the poet reading their poem in their own language. That would be wonderful.
Well, or like I like to do is get an actor or somebody who, I don't mind them, kind of spicing it up to their own taste, but it's fun to get them to read it and, and bounce back and forth with the Spanish and the English. But I found a couple of these, and some of them really like to ham it up, and it's kind of great.
Exactly. That would be the great danger, I think.
Well, it's okay, because you always go back and read it again. But I don't think they're changing necessarily, but I think that, the sense of, of exclamations and surprise and, all those little subtleties that a good actor and a good reader can throw in there. It makes a big difference. And I find it very entertaining.
You know,
And
I always think two things about poetry. One is that poetry is really language under tremendous pressure. And there's a kind of beauty that comes out because of that. And so, you know, sometimes the translation, when you were reading the comparable translation into English and Spanish, and how the English often failed to translate that pressure, that kind of, there's something kind of a torque on the language. The other thing that like, there's a translation right there. The other thing I was thinking about was that, I mean, poetry is itself a translation. I mean, as poets, that's exactly what we do, is translate the world around us through what we write. So we have, you know, what we write, and then we have the translator, and then sometimes we have the second translator, and then we have the final product. I find all of that really, really, really fascinating. And of course, you know, there is a huge wealth of translation from the Arabic novelists and poets that is getting bigger and bigger every year. So that's like full speed right now. And incredible writers, including Iraqi writers, novelists and poets who are just kind of, you know, roll your socks down when you read them. So, yeah, I mean, I think translation is so important. You know, I think it should really be mandatory in curriculum for elementary grades, that really young people, you know, from third grade on, have the experience of reading a translation, of experiencing another culture through the poetry from that culture in translation. I think that's something that scores should really try and include in whatever kind of curriculum that you have already. Maybe you're already doing that, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful idea too, and also to give all the bilingual people in the classroom ability to shine and to, you know, talk about that. It's also, sometimes I have my students translate from a language they don't speak, and just try to listen to the rhythm and the sounds of the words, and then recreate something, obviously, far away from the poem.
You know, we had an exhibit in the Washington, D.C. area, and at one of the galleries, they had some of our letterpress broadsides up that had a poem in English and including, I remember one broadside just had it in Arabic. And so someone related the story of like a 5th grade class coming in and looking at that. And there was one young boy who, that was his first language, was Arabic. And he was able to step forward and translate it for all of his fellow students. And the teacher was trying to convey to me how wonderful it made that young boy feel that he could be that link to bring that poem into English.
Yeah, I had an experience like that where a friend of mine is taught the 3rd grade. So would you come in and read some poems, because we're having poetry writing. And of course, the great thing about 3rd graders is they, you know, they haven't developed the filters yet that we all have. And that, you know, in writing poetry, we have to kind of try to abandon. So, and there were, you know, probably a third of the class were young Hispanic children. And so I read poems. And then I said, hey, would you like to read the poem now in Spanish? And they, oh yeah, that would be great. Because their English was not that, they were just learning English. So they were just big smiles. And all of a sudden our participation within the class became, it was like they weren't other, they were now part of the class. And it made, so it really connected them. And I thought that was really an interesting way to, it's that cross-cultural experience that broadens all our horizons and makes us citizens of the world and dispels
Right.
nationalism and all that nonsense. And so that was the firsthand experience to watch these little kids just light up, when that occurred.
That's
Yeah,
a great
well, I
story.
do appreciate that, and sort of full circle to scores. We definitely do try to intentionally do things like that in terms of reading literary moments and sharing, allowing people to come forward in their own language or mix of languages, and often with art as well for those that are learning, right? To start with just art or talking, and then into reading, writing and sharing. And Hamza, I think, is on our call too. And one of the things that I hope we can do is more around. We do a lot with Spanish. It's a big part of our program audience, but we do have this really rich multicultural intersection and Arabic poetry and its rich tradition. I hope we can bring more of that into our collage of language and poetry. So we share your spirit there. Stephen, we're sort of at the end of our lunch hour here.
Okay.
I'll let you. Well, anybody can have the last word here. We'll again, I'll just say, just share appreciation for you and for opening up, your deep thinking and experience with this. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, an important topic, as Bo said. And hopefully, again, this will just be the tip of the iceberg for those that of us that are learning more about it, want to learn more. Again, hopefully you'll come see Bo's session on the Al Matunabi street project that Hamza was part of as well, shared about. And David's work is fascinating. And the session you had this week, David, thank you. That's available on the archive. So I encourage people to dig deeper. But Stephen, what's how do we close this out?
Well,
you gonna sing some Bob Dylan for us? What are you gonna do?
No. I think we keep the open mind, and I think that we touched upon at the end about translation bridging the gap between cultures and nations and just in individuals. I mean, that's the gift that brings us all, and I think that's what we need to use it as a tool to do just that. It doesn't necessarily have to be an interpretive weapon or utensil, so to speak. I mean, I think it does have it has a use beyond that.
Yeah. Well said. Anybody, any final words from Bo, David? Thank you again for joining us.
Oh, I just wanted to say about the dog barking. I've always been interested in different cultures. I think because of the language you speak, you probably hear the dog differently based on the languages that you come from. I just think that's a fascinating little.
That's a whole nother lecture. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, I thought I had enough to think about already, but now they've taken me to another level. But yeah, apologies for my dog's interjections there.
I think that the dogs sound differently depending upon what hour in the morning the dog is barking.
Absolutely. Your reaction is certainly different at the hour. Good. All right. Well, again, Stephen, you summed it up so nicely. Let's close those gaps. Let's take the power of poetry across cultural, cultures and arbitrary borders, and unite people. So thank you all for the work that you're doing, frontline work in this effort. And thanks again for being part of Summit. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure. Thank you all. Bye-bye now.
All right. Thanks, Stephen.